He was one of the most powerful men in the music industry, untouchable, celebrated, and always in control. But behind the flashing lights and private jets, a much darker story was quietly unfolding. A former assistant, long forgotten by the public, has now come forward with shocking revelations that are shaking the foundation of an empire built on fame, fear, and silence. What you're about to hear isn't gossip. It's a documented testimony, names, places, patterns. And once you start listening, you won't be able to stop. If you're tired of mainstream media skipping the truth, hit subscribe. We bring you the stories they won't. The facts they bury. The voices they try to silence. Stay informed. Stay awake. Stay with us. The courtroom was only half full. Day 12 of the trial had been billed as another dry session, focused on financial records and corporate structure, a day for accountants and tax consultants, not headlines. Reporters had left their backup batteries at home. Spectators who usually queued around the block had opted for work or brunch. Even Judge Subramanian seemed more relaxed, shuffling papers with a rare hint of boredom. Sean Diddy Combs sat at the defense table in a muted navy suit, posture composed, conferring with his legal team. He didn't glance toward the gallery. He didn't need to. He'd done this for years, dominate the room by pretending it wasn't even worth noticing. At 10:13 a.m., the prosecutor rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm but cutting through the ambient hum like a blade, "the government calls David James to the stand." There was a second of silence. Then confusion. People looked around. There was a shuffle of papers, the soft thump of a dropped pen. Diddy's attorney blinked, leaned in toward his client. "James," he mouthed. No one moved. Then the side door opened. David James stepped into the room. He walked in slowly but steadily, dressed in a simple gray blazer, no tie. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't smile. His face was calm, but beneath the surface was a tension that registered immediately, even among the most skeptical in the room. Diddy turned. His eyes narrowed. For the first time during the trial, his fingers gripped the edge of the table. A whisper rippled across the gallery. "Who is that?" "That's him, the assistant." Oh my God. David James had been a ghost. Former employees whispered about him but never publicly. He had no social media. No press appearances. No podcast exposés. He had walked away in 2009 and never looked back, until now. As James approached the witness stand, even the courtroom sketch artist froze for a moment, pencil midair. "Raise your right hand," the clerk instructed. He did. Firm, unwavering. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, then finally looked up, and met Diddy's eyes. Not defiantly. Not with hatred. Just a long, steady gaze that said, "You know why I'm here." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Mr. James," she began, keeping her tone gentle, "can you please state your full name and occupation for the record?" "David Matthew James," he said. "Former personal assistant to Mr. Combs from 2007 to 2009. A hum swept the gallery. Phones were raised in defiance of the no-recording rule. Security shifted, too late to stop it. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Order," he said mildly, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he seemed caught off guard. The prosecutor continued. "Mr. James, why have you decided to testify today?" David looked straight ahead. "Because this story isn't about business contracts or stock options. It's about people. Real people. And what happens to them when they get pulled into a system built to use them up and throw them away." Silence. Then a pen scratched furiously. James went on. "For years, I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't my story to tell. That I wasn't the victim. That I had moved on. But watching this trial unfold, reading the stories, seeing the same things happen to new people, I realized my silence was complicity. Diddy's lawyer stood suddenly. Objection, narrative. The judge nodded. Sustained. Mr. James, please answer in response to the questions asked. The prosecutor leaned in slightly. Let's go back to the beginning. Tell us how you came to work for Mr. Combs. James took a breath. I was 22. Just graduated with a degree in event management. One of my professors had a cousin working for Bad Boy Records. He made a call. I got an interview. And what was the job? Runner. Assistant. Errand guy. Whatever he needed. He paused. At first, it felt like winning the lottery. There was a flicker of a smile on his face, but it faded quickly. Travel. Access. Money. You get pulled into the lifestyle fast. But you also learn the rules just as quickly: stay invisible. Say yes. Don't ask questions. The prosecutor nodded. Did your duties ever include preparing hotel rooms for private gatherings? James' face didn't change. Yes. Can you describe what that entailed? He did not hesitate. I would get a call. Usually last minute. Sometimes from Diddy. Sometimes from one of his senior staff. I'd be told the location, time, and the guest list, first names only. And the supplies? He looked down at his hands for a moment. Baby oil. Condoms. Bottled water. Energy drinks. Hand towels. Soundproof padding. Sometimes alcohol. Sometimes cocaine. Xanax. MDMA. Once even GHB. The courtroom recoiled in collective silence. The judge glanced at the defense. Diddy's lawyers were whispering furiously among themselves. Were you told what these gatherings were? He nodded slowly. They called them freak-offs. The words hung in the air. Did you attend these events? No. Staff wasn't allowed to stay unless ordered to. And if you were ordered to stay, it wasn't a promotion. There was a grim undercurrent to his tone. The prosecutor continued. Did you ever witness anyone being harmed? James hesitated for the first time. I never saw direct violence. But I saw people leave those rooms crying. I saw women so intoxicated they couldn't stand. I saw security carry out more than one girl who couldn't speak. A murmur rose. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. David remained still. One time, he said quietly, one of our own collapsed. Layla rose. She worked logistics. She was with me on setup duty. She hadn't eaten in 24 hours, hadn't slept in 36. She passed out while wheeling in a crate of bottled water. He looked up again. We called an ambulance. They listed it as dehydration. Diddy told me later she was just being dramatic. There were audible gasps in the gallery. And what happened to her? She was fired 2 weeks later. Told she wasn't cut out for the pace. Diddy was now leaning forward, face pale, fists clenched. His attorney whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. The judge signaled for a recess, but the silence lingered even after he left the bench. David remained on the stand, unmoved. In less than 20 minutes, a forgotten assistant had turned the most powerful man in the room into a man cornered by memory. And the trial had just shifted into something else entirely. David James sat upright in the witness chair, shoulders squared. The courtroom, once restless, now hung on his every word. There was no coughing, no whispering, no shuffling papers. The silence felt heavy. The prosecutor, sensing the gravity of the room, kept her tone steady. Mr. James, let's go back to the beginning. Tell us about your first weeks working for Mr. Combs. David nodded slowly. I started in October of 2007. I was 22, fresh out of college, thought I had landed the dream job. Everyone said it was a golden opportunity. I believed them. He let out a small, dry exhale, not quite a laugh. First week, I was on airport runs. Picking up celebrities, stylists, executives. Second week, I was flying with him. Third week, I was waking up in different time zones and had no idea what day it was. You learn fast that time doesn't work the same way in that world. Sleep is optional. Food is incidental. Presence is everything. Presence, the prosecutor asked. You're expected to be there. Wherever there is. At 3 a.m. in a hotel hallway. In the studio at noon after a red-eye flight. In the car, waiting. You don't question it. You move. She nodded. Did you live on site? Most of the time. Either in a suite next door or in the staff quarters of one of his homes. It was easier that way. You'd never survive commuting. The prosecutor retrieved a folder and handed it to the clerk, who passed it to David. I'm showing you Exhibit 114. Do you recognize this? David glanced at it. Yeah. This was a prep checklist. I wrote it. Can you tell the court what it is? It's a room setup protocol. For special guests. Usually at a hotel suite. Sometimes at one of his houses. The prosecutor read aloud. 2 sets of clean towels. White. 1 stack by the bed, 1 in the bathroom. Baby oil. Scented and unscented. Brand specified. Bluetooth speaker pre-connected. No cameras visible. Phones in lockbox. Rope. Blindfold. Condoms. Xanax. Liquor. She lowered the sheet. The jury was visibly disturbed. Diddy didn't look up. Were you instructed to prepare these items yourself? Yes. Sometimes personally. Sometimes through others. But the instruction always came from someone in the inner circle. And it was clear who they were working for. The prosecutor's voice softened. When did you realize this wasn't just eccentric celebrity behavior? David looked down at the microphone for a moment. The first time I heard the term, freak off, he said. He sat back in the chair, recalling. It was New Year's Eve 2007. We were in Miami. Diddy told me to reserve 2 adjoining suites at the Seta. One was for him and his inner circle. The other wasn't. He paused. He said, make sure it's stocked. Same as before. Full freak-off setup. Had he used that term before? No. And I asked what that meant. He looked at me and laughed like I was stupid. Said, just handle it. You'll see. The prosecutor waited a beat, letting the room absorb it. So you prepared the room? I did. Everything on that list. When the guests started arriving, young women, mostly, early 20s, maybe younger, security collected their phones at the door. One girl asked if she'd get her phone back afterward. I told her yes. I don't know if she did. He took a breath. The music was loud. I stayed outside. That was the rule, set up and leave. But you could still hear things. Laughing. Screaming. Sometimes crying. David's voice didn't change. But the courtroom could feel the weight. The prosecutor continued, more slowly now. How often did events like this happen? Twice a week. Sometimes more. Depends on the city. He called them celebrations. We called them shifts. The jury sat motionless, several with their pens frozen mid-note. Did anyone ever express concern? Among the staff? All the time. But no one said anything out loud. You'd lose your job. Maybe more. What do you mean? David looked directly at the jury. There was no HR. There was control. If you pushed back, your paycheck got delayed, your access got revoked, your reputation got poisoned. You became disloyal. That was the worst thing you could be. He looked toward the gallery, toward no one in particular. Loyalty was everything. Loyalty kept you fed. Disloyalty got you ghosted. The prosecutor nodded gravely. Let's talk about Layla Rose. David's jaw tightened. He nodded once. She was a logistics coordinator. Came in early 2008. Smart. Fast. A machine. I think she slept less than I did. What happened to her? We were setting up for one of those nights, downtown Manhattan. It was her third shift in a row. No breaks. No food. She collapsed outside the suite. I called security, then the concierge. They brought paramedics. Dehydration, they said. Low blood pressure. He swallowed. She was in the hospital for 2 days. And what happened after that? Nothing. No one checked on her. When she came back, she had a meeting with Diddy. An hour later, she was gone. Her badge stopped working. Was she fired? David nodded. She was let go for health reasons. That's what they told us. Did that incident change your thinking? He was quiet for a moment. I started keeping notes, he said finally. Not just about that night. About everything. I started to feel like I was watching something I didn't want to be a part of. But I couldn't leave yet. Why not? He gave a sad smile. Because leaving meant disappearing. And at that time, I still thought I could make it. That if I stayed long enough, played the game well enough, maybe I'd earn something that made it all worth it. The room was hushed. Even Diddy's lawyers had stopped whispering. The prosecutor retrieved a thin notebook and held it up. This is Government Exhibit 115. Your notes. David nodded. Yes. Did you share these with anyone at the time? No. Not until this case began. Why now? David looked at the judge, at the attorneys, then squarely at the jury. Because I finally understand the truth. I wasn't just a witness. I was part of the machinery. I helped things happen. And that's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. But staying silent won't make it lighter. There was no dramatic music. No gasps. Just silence. A silence heavier than any noise could ever be. The judge tapped his gavel. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the judge stood, so did the tension in the room. But David James remained seated, still as stone, the truth now spoken, and the cracks in Diddy's empire growing wider by the second. The courtroom was full again after recess. Word had spread. Reporters who had skipped the morning session rushed in with notepads half-filled and hearts racing. Legal analysts whispered predictions into phones. Spectators who hadn't managed a seat stood too deep at the back wall. Something had changed. Everyone felt it. David James sat back on the witness stand, composed, eyes steady. Across the room, Diddy sat motionless, his legal team huddled tighter than before. He hadn't looked up since James had returned. The prosecutor rose again. Mr. James, she said, returning to her spot before the jury, earlier you mentioned you began taking notes. Was there a particular incident that triggered that decision? James nodded. Yes. February 2008. We were in Los Angeles. Another weekend party at one of Diddy's properties in the hills. Nothing unusual, at first. He leaned slightly forward, elbows on the edge of the witness box. The house was huge, multi-level. Staff had been working for 3 days preparing it. The studio was a converted pool house, he'd had it soundproofed and locked off from the rest of the property. No one was allowed inside unless personally cleared by him. "Were you ever permitted inside?" the prosecutor asked. James shook his head. "Not once. That was unusual. I'd been in every green room, every studio, every vehicle. But that room? Off limits. Even to inner circle staff." "Why did that concern you?" "Because of the patterns. The secrecy. The mood shifts." He looked directly at the jury. "It was always the same. Party set up. Guests arrived. Phones locked. One or two women brought aside. Then he'd vanish for hours into the pool house. When he came back, he was either hyper or completely silent. Either way, the air changed." The prosecutor walked to the evidence table and picked up a printed photo. "Government Exhibit 129, she announced, showing it to the jury. "Mr. James, do you recognize this location?" James glanced at it. "Yes. That's the pool house. The LA property." The image showed a modern structure surrounded by thick hedges and a tall metal gate. Innocuous. But in this room, it felt ominous. The prosecutor placed it back down and continued. "Let's talk about the staff. Beyond Ms. Rose, did you observe any others who were affected by the working conditions?" James exhaled slowly. "More than I can count. But it wasn't just the hours. It was the fear. Everyone operated on edge. If he said jump, you jumped, because the cost of hesitating was your job." He paused, then added, "Or worse, your silence." "Can you clarify?" "There was an assistant named Trev. Quiet guy. Efficient. One day, he confronted the house manager about expense reports. There were charges being assigned to him, liquor, transport, even charges from events he wasn't at. The next day, he was gone. Fired? No one said it. Just, gone. Phone shut off. Badge disabled. His name was blacklisted across the tour network. I ran into him 6 months later. He was working at a UPS store in Phoenix." The prosecutor nodded solemnly. "Earlier, you mentioned a culture of silence. Did that extend to the guests?" James hesitated. "Yes. I remember one woman, early 20s. Her name was Selena. She'd been invited by a mutual industry friend. She arrived excited. Within an hour, I saw her crying on the back steps. She said she wanted to leave. I went to get her things." His voice dropped. "Security stopped me. Told me she was fine and that she'd leave with the rest." "Did she?" "I don't know. I wasn't allowed to follow up." The courtroom was silent. The jury sat still, eyes fixed on the witness. "Mr. James, did you attempt to raise these concerns with anyone?" James gave a sad laugh. "To who? The label? His people? Everyone was on the payroll. Everyone had something to lose. We weren't employees. We were parts of the machine." The prosecutor stepped closer. "Let's discuss the evidence you kept. Your notes." She walked to the table and held up a binder. "This contains your handwritten entries from 2008 to 2009. Can you confirm their authenticity?" James nodded. "Yes. They were locked in a safety box until this year." She flipped to a page. "March 14, 2008. You wrote, 'Set up at Mondrian.' Code name, Red Room. Explicit guest list. 2 girls crying in hallway. Told to stay out of it. What does Red Room refer to?" A designated suite Diddy had modified for private entertainment. It had red lighting, blackout curtains, and a camera system. I wasn't allowed in once the door closed. And the cameras? They weren't for security. They were recording. A gasp broke from the gallery. Judge Subramanian lifted his eyes but let it pass. Were recordings ever referenced in staff discussions? James nodded grimly. Sometimes when someone complained about being mistreated or wanting to quit, we'd hear phrases like, "She knows better." "We've got tape," or "He should remember what happened in Atlanta." It was implied. But everyone knew what it meant. The prosecutor stood still for a moment, then asked quietly, "Did you ever feel threatened?" James looked toward the defense table. Yes. He let the word hang. There was a night in Vegas. April 2009. I had been late bringing supplies to a shoot. He pulled me aside. Not in anger, he was calm. He said, "You're too smart to mess up. Too close to matter. You know what happens to people who forget their place." Then he smiled. Patted my cheek. Walked away. Did he ever physically assault you? No. He didn't have to. His words were enough. The threat was always just under the surface. The prosecutor gave the jury a moment to absorb it all before she asked her final question. "What kept you from speaking out before now?" James looked down. Then up. Shame. Fear. Guilt. All of it. He leaned forward slightly. But mostly, because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Or care. I wasn't a celebrity. I didn't have a platform. I was just the guy who carried the bags and kept the schedule. But watching the stories come out this past year, seeing women, staff, even artists speak up, I realized I wasn't the only one. And I couldn't stay silent anymore. The prosecutor stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Subramanian looked at the clock. "We'll proceed with cross-examination after lunch recess." But no one moved. Not at first. Not until David James finally stepped down, eyes fixed forward, walking past the man he once served, and the man he just exposed. David James returned to the witness stand after lunch. His posture remained upright, his hands steady, but there was a new tension behind his eyes. The weight of what he'd already said, and what was coming, hung thick in the air. Diddy still hadn't made eye contact. He sat rigid at the defense table, lips pressed into a thin line, arms folded. His lead attorney, Melvin Grant, adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped toward the podium. The room hushed. "Mr. James," Grant began, voice calm but pointed, "you've made serious allegations against my client. Let's begin by establishing something simple. You worked for Mr. Combs for 2 years, correct?" "Yes," David replied. "And during that time, you were paid well above the industry standard for assistants, had access to 5-star accommodations, travel benefits, and industry connections most would envy?" "I was compensated," David said carefully. "But that doesn't negate what I witnessed." "Of course," Grant said, nodding theatrically. "Let's talk about your motivations. You left Mr. Combs' employment in 2009. Why come forward now, over 15 years later?" David paused. "Because it took me that long to understand the full scope of what I'd been part of. And because silence is part of the problem." Grant smiled slightly, a predator scenting weakness. "Or perhaps you're here now because you failed to break into the industry, failed to capitalize on your proximity to success, and now you see an opportunity for attention. For a second chance." David didn't flinch. "No. I turned down interviews. Book deals. I stayed in the background for a reason. I didn't want fame. I wanted to forget." Grant's expression cooled. "Then let's refresh your memory. These photos," he held up a stack of glossy images, "show you attending high-profile events with Mr. Combs. Smiling. Drinking. Enjoying yourself. This one, for example, Grammy After Party, February 2008. He held it up to the jury. "Do you deny being there?" "No," David answered. "I was there. I was required to be." "And smiling?" David leaned forward slightly. Have you ever smiled while your stomach was in knots? Because you knew a single mistake could end your career? Because someone was watching from across the room and you weren't sure if tonight would be the night they turned on you? Grant's smile faded. You claim to have been under extreme stress, to have witnessed disturbing conduct, yet you stayed. Why not quit? I tried. Twice. Each time I was reminded how small I was in comparison. He didn't need to threaten me. He just needed to remind me that my references, my career, even my safety depended on loyalty. You're saying Mr. Combs threatened you? No. He never said the words. He didn't have to. Grant's jaw tightened. He flipped to another page in his binder. In 2011, 2 years after leaving Bad Boy, you wrote a freelance article for an online music blog praising Mr. Combs as a visionary businessman and thanking him for the most formative years of your life. Is that your writing? It is, David admitted. So which David James should we believe? The one calling him a visionary, or the one sitting here today calling him a predator? David didn't blink. Both. Because back then I hadn't allowed myself to face what really happened. I still needed to believe that it all had value. That I hadn't been complicit in something dark. That I hadn't helped. The courtroom was silent again. Grant paced slowly, trying to regain momentum. You've described preparing rooms, delivering supplies, witnessing suspicious behavior, but you never claimed to have seen an actual crime, correct? David exhaled. I saw harm. I saw fear. I saw people stripped of agency. If you want to debate the legal threshold, that's not my field. But I know abuse when I see it. And yet you kept working. I was 22. I thought I could handle anything. I thought I was lucky. Grant's voice sharpened. And now you sit here accusing a man who gave you opportunity, who brought you into a world you never could have entered alone, because what? You regret it? You're angry. You want revenge? No, David said quietly. I want truth. There was a flicker of movement at the defense table. For the first time, Diddy looked up. His eyes locked on David. But the intensity that once commanded rooms was gone. In its place was something else, resentment, maybe. Or disbelief. The prosecutor rose from her seat. Redirect, Your Honor. The judge nodded. She approached slowly, meeting David's eyes with a quiet steadiness. Mr. James, earlier the defense asked why you stayed. Let me ask, why did you finally leave? David didn't hesitate. Because I couldn't stand what I was becoming. He looked out at the courtroom. There was this new assistant. Nina. Just 19. She asked me one night, is this normal? And I didn't have an answer. I told her, keep your head down, do the job. But when I heard myself say it, I felt sick. Because that was exactly what they had told me. And that's when you left. Yes. I packed my things that night. Gave no notice. Took a bus to D.C., slept on a friend's couch for 6 weeks. The prosecutor nodded. Earlier, you said silence was part of the system. What did you mean? The abuse doesn't survive without silence. Without the assistants who look away. Without the staff who just follow orders. Without the lawyers who draw up the NDAs. Everyone plays a part. Including me. And I'm here to own that. A hush fell again. This time it wasn't shock, it was respect. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. James, you may step down. David stood slowly. As he turned from the stand, he passed by the defense table. For one moment, his gaze caught Diddy's. No words were exchanged. But something passed between them, a silent recognition. Of shared history. Of fractured trust. Of truth that could no longer be ignored. As David walked toward the exit, the room remained silent. He didn't look back. Melvin Grant sat back, face pale. Diddy was still staring at the floor. And the jury, some of whom had begun the day skeptical, even bored, now sat leaning forward, eyes focused, pens forgotten. Something irreversible had happened. Not a single person in the room could deny it. It was the final day of testimony. By now, the media had descended on the courthouse like locusts. News vans lined the block, camera tripods formed a perimeter around the front steps, and the metal detectors beeped non-stop as spectators and journalists poured into the gallery. Everyone knew something rare had unfolded here. One of the music industry's untouchables had been pierced, not by scandalous headlines or paparazzi gossip, but by the calm, relentless voice of a man they'd all forgotten. David James was gone. His testimony complete, he'd returned to obscurity. No press conferences. No interviews. Just the image of him stepping into a cab after court, disappearing into the city. But his words lingered. Now it was time for the prosecution to deliver its final blow. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Even Judge Subramanian seemed different, sharper, colder. The kind of presence that signaled the game was nearing its end. The prosecution began its closing with a stillness that made the room lean forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead attorney said, eyes scanning the box, "what you've heard over the past 3 weeks isn't just a series of uncomfortable stories. It's a pattern. A deliberate system built on power, intimidation, manipulation, and silence." She clicked a remote. The courtroom screen lit up with a timeline. 2007, David James begins his employment. Within weeks, he's managing not just logistics, but secrecy. He's running errands no assistant should. Preparing rooms not for business, but for abuse. Another click. A photo of the LA pool house. 2008, the pool house. Modified, soundproofed, surveilled. No paperwork. No records. Just whispers and trauma. She turned back to the jury. They called them freak-offs. Behind the music, the brands, the philanthropy, there was a hidden world. A world where staff were dispensable. Where women became props. Where the lines between loyalty and complicity vanished. She let the silence sit. No one here is accusing the defendant of one bad night. One mistake. We're showing you that this was calculated. That it relied on fear, on NDAs, on status, and most of all, on the assumption that no one would dare speak. She walked slowly across the front of the jury box. But someone did. David's name didn't need to be said again. His presence was still in the wood grain of the bench, the quiet inhale of each juror, the unease in the defense table's posture. And what did Mr. James gain from telling you his truth? Nothing. No book deal. No payday. He stepped forward because silence was no longer an option. The prosecutor closed the laptop. Walked back to the podium. You don't need a smoking gun. You don't need a video confession. You have witness after witness, document after document, and the testimony of a man who was there. Who lived it? Who carried the guilt for years? Her voice dropped. And now it's yours to carry. For just long enough to return a verdict. Then it was Melvin Grant's turn. He stood slowly, fixing his tie as he faced the jury. Calm. Polished. The image of control. "Let's be honest," he began. "You've heard some disturbing stories. No one denies that Mr. Combs leads a larger-than-life lifestyle. He's a celebrity. An empire. A brand. That comes with eccentricities. And yes, excess." He turned slightly. "But eccentric does not equal criminal." He clicked his remote. David James. A man who admits he never saw a crime. A man who, by his own admission, smiled, networked, accepted the perks, and left with a thank you blog post. A beat. And now, 15 years later, he remembers everything. In vivid detail. With a narrative that just happens to align with headlines, rumors, and social media accusations. Grant moved closer to the jury. What you saw on that stand was not justice. It was catharsis. A man unburdening himself, yes. But that burden doesn't belong on my client. He walked back to the defense table. There's no physical evidence. No victims pressing charges. Just one man's interpretation of events clouded by regret, guilt, and perhaps ambition. He paused. You may dislike Mr. Combs. You may find his behavior troubling. But that is not the same as guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He rested his hand on the table. Do not let spectacle become substitution for proof. Then he sat. The judge gave instructions, clear and methodical. The jury rose and disappeared into deliberation. And the courtroom exhaled. Hours passed. Reporters filed updates. Legal analysts speculated. Some said the case was too ambiguous. Others said Diddy's silence during David's testimony had doomed him. Then, just before sunset, the jury returned. The foreperson handed the verdict slip to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The room froze. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the judge read, "We find the defendant guilty." Murmurs broke out. On the charge of unlawful coercion, guilty. A gasp. On the charge of maintaining a network for illicit sexual activity. A pause. Guilty. Diddy didn't move. He stared ahead, face impassive. But his knuckles whitened. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then he turned to the defendant. Mr. Combs, you will remain in custody until sentencing. Bail is denied. Gasps, again. Flashbulbs went off. Security moved in. The empire of Sean Diddy Combs had cracked. As he stood to be cuffed, he finally turned, to the gallery, to the press, maybe to the ghosts behind him. But David wasn't there. Outside, the world erupted. Phones rang. Headlines flashed. But somewhere quiet, in a small apartment far from the courthouse, David James sat alone, eyes on the floor, the television off. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was remembering. Every hallway. Every locked door. Every time he'd told himself to stay quiet. And now, finally, he wasn't. Not anymore.